Good morning. Welcome to the Uncharted Territories Strategies for Managing Today's Corporate Travel Value Chain, presented by GBTA and made possible through sponsorship by Mesh. Well, we're really looking forward to a great conversation today. And I just wanted to start with a few housekeeping items before we start. I'm Norm Rose, president of Travel Tech Consulting. And I have a very distinguished panel that we're going to be introducing in a moment that will have a great discussion about multiple topics around corporate travel this morning. So generally, we'll leave time at the end of the webinar for questions. But if you have some burning questions that you want to ask, there's a Q&A box within Zoom. Please ask that. We'll be monitoring that, and we will stop our discussion and answer those questions because at the end of the day, this webinar is for you. We have a lot of difficult areas to discuss, some challenges that we have in corporate travel management everyone's aware of, and I think we'll have some real valuable discussion. So on my panel today, we have, in addition to myself, Kim Hammer, who's a partner at Results Plus Consulting, former BTN Travel Manager of the Year, Lisa Riley, who's a senior consultant at Gold Spring, and Anna King, who's the CFO at Mesh Payments. So with that being said, let's start this process. So corporate travel, it's being impacted by kind of two major changes in the marketplace. One, which everyone's been trying to deal with, which is the changes in distribution. And as we'll talk, it's not just changes in air and NDC, a whole restructuring is happening with distribution. And it's presenting lots of challenges, not only in service, but in content and just, in general, a very challenging environment. But the other thing that's happening, which is very close to my heart, since it's something I've been measuring my whole career, is emerging technologies, particular AI and generative AI is now coming into the marketplace, probably even faster than many would have hoped. And accelerating. And so therefore, how do we deal with these two things among many other things in the marketplace? And so we're going to have a conversation. We have some scripted questions and so forth. We're looking for questions from you all as well. But the key thing is to try to provide you some value. So let's start off with this concept of governance. So governance, I think, simply put, is overseeing the control and direction of a program or process. So what does governance really mean in corporate travel? Travel managers have perhaps taken that title seriously, saying, I manage travel, but do you really manage travel, or is it budget owners that manage travel? How do you develop a governance that integrates the needs of the company, the travelers, and then this reality of the changing market? So let's start with Lisa. What do you think of, how would you define governance in corporate travel, and then how does it need to be adapted and evolved with the current market conditions?
Yeah, thanks, Norm. This is one of my favorite topics to talk about because especially nowadays, with all of these changes that you were just mentioning that are happening, very few travel managers are the actual final decision maker of major suppliers or technologies or risk companies, right? Those final decisions, because they're so big, are really made at very executive C-suite levels. So you have to have a governance structure that incorporates the C-suite, HR, risk management, human resources, technology. You've got to have that team put together that can help the travel manager make all of these decisions along the way that are part of their strategy, right? So the other piece of this is you have to have the strategy to present to your C-suite, but you have to have the input from all of these different executive levels because you're going to be making so many changes that are coming along the way. And these people can help you bring your strategy to life.
That's great, Lisa. Thank you. Thank you. Kim, would you like to comment on the
Yeah,
on the
sure.
concept here? Yeah.
Happy to add to that. Thanks, Norm. And Lisa, I think it's a great segue. I would encourage all travel managers, as you build out your strategy and are trying to deliver, many of you probably have some type of travel council already in place where you're working with EAs and travelers to really understand their needs. But I would encourage you to extend that beyond to have an executive travel council. So all of the players that Lisa just mentioned are critically important to the organization and help make decisions. They can also act as your change champions. So if you set up this executive travel council, it really enables you from a governance standpoint to have that leadership support from the top down that can help spread the message throughout the organization. I think that's really important.
That's great.
I've seen in the last, maybe even as recently the last 3 years, travel managers or um, sourcing travel managers spend so much time rewriting a travel policy or so much time investigating a supplier, maybe RFPing a supplier, maybe even awarding a supplier. And then it goes time to implement, and the C-suite is saying cease and desist, right? Because they didn't have that buy-in, they didn't have that awareness, through all of those layers. So it's just so you can't assume it. It's so critically important to make sure that you have that in place sooner rather than later.
So Anna, as the CFO of Mesh, you're a senior executive. How do you, apart from being a vendor in the space, I'm sure you have fiscal responsibility. You're there for. How do you work with travel management for your own organization, and what type of governance works best within Mesh?
Yeah, so I'm a big believer in transparency. And I think it's really important to look to the travel managers. I know they want to do the right thing for the company. They're trying to make sure that they make the best decisions possible. And so for me, I want to make sure I'm communicating what those strategic goals are, and what's driving those budget constraints so that the travel managers can bake that into their recommendations that they present to the executive team. I will say, we have a lot on our plates. We're thinking of a lot of different things. So when you're presenting to us, I had a boss who used to say, you got to feed them the mashed potatoes and the baby carrots, right? So
Sounds
put
like
it in a
parents.
way that's, simple enough for us to digest and understand, right? I'm a big believer in numbers, showing the impact. For me, that helps me and that will sway me into making a decision. But those are some of my recommendations, right? It's just make sure, you need that transparency from the executive team. And then when you're communicating that back, kind of tie in those strategic goals so that they understand that you heard them and that you're aligned.
That's great. So let's just delve a little bit deeper into this, because I'm sure that everyone, including receiving presentations in your case, Anna, but for the other two consultants and myself, have had lots of senior management presentations. And it's kind of like when you were saying feeding them, feeding them slowly. It's almost like going back to kindergarten. I mean, you have to kind of be very, very simple, and we get so involved with the jargon and the trends. I have seen many conversations go awry because the senior manager is thinking about something. You could tell that their mind is shifting, and I really don't care about that. I've got all these other things I have to do. Tell me what I need to do and what you need from me. So how do we simplify this, Kim? How do we make this how do you develop a strategy in a complex world that then resonates with senior management to get their support?
Yeah, there are a couple of different things. You have to consider who you're talking to. I think Anna made a really valid point about, how to either feed them slowly or give them tidbits. At the end of the day, all of the acronyms that we know and use and appreciate so well don't need to be used when you're talking to executive level. They need to understand the strategy. And as Anna said, they need to know that it aligns with corporate goals and with the corporate culture. And you need to speak in your own company's language to help people understand what are you trying to deliver and how is this strategy important to making sure that the employees are able to do what they need to do within the budget that has been set by the company.
Lisa, any additional input on how best to overcome the acronyms and the complexity and explain it simply to senior management to get their support?
Yeah, as soon as you asked that a question initially, the first thing that came to mind was get rid of the acronyms, because I'm sure we have all sat there and had conversation and people are like, sorry, NDC or TMC, right? The basics for us. I think just keeping the message simple, just like everybody has said. What is it that that specific stakeholder needs to know? What's the impact to that stakeholder's um, part in the organization, and what help do you need from them? Because your senior level people want to help, right? Because it's going to help the organization. So those, I think those are three basic things they need to know. They don't need to know what NDC is. They just need to know what is the effect and impact that NDC is and benefit NDC can have for his or her part of the
Yeah.
organization.
Well, we'll talk more about that in a few moments. I always remember when I started at Sun Microsystems in the late 80s, I met with all the direct reports to the CEO. And I met the head of sales and customer service. It was about 70% of the cost of travel was in his organization. I wanted to meet with him about policy. So we spent about 10 minutes talking about policy. Then he spent the rest of the time telling me how he needed a Lufthansa senator's card. And I need to get that for him. So I mean, so what I'm implying here is sometimes senior management are very heavy travelers and they think of themselves, they think of travel from a personal level. I mean, we're in this industry where we have an unusual thing where something's purchased by the company, but it's personally experienced. So, any comments on how to deal with senior managers who also express feelings of being travelers? Any thoughts on that?
Travel, the one thing that doesn't change is that travel is very emotive, no matter how you look at it and what way you spin it. And it basically all of the executives it touches, and I'm sure Anna can comment on this as well. But if you keep it simple and direct, used data and facts, you can take a lot of the emotion out of the decision making. And so you really need to understand and know your data and what it is you're trying to achieve and how to ask for the support that you need. And I think in that instance, that kind of helps set you up with the executives so that they understand what the needs are and they can help you drive those decisions down.
Yeah. Any additional advice, Lisa, on how to deal with a senior manager who may be thinking in terms of their own travel experience?
Well, I think all of that applies regardless of even your title, right? So whether it's a senior manager or a road warrior, they want the same thing. They want a hassle-free trip. They want an easy booking experience. They want to be able to make changes. So it's all about making that traveler satisfied and happy, while they're traveling, regardless of title. And
Okay.
and we'll talk about it, I think, later, but policy also is a big part of it.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's talk about educating employees in kind of post-pandemic realities. I've heard from a lot of travel managers. Well, first of all, we have a lot of new travel managers who seem to have come on board after the pandemic, and then we have travelers who either forgot how to travel or are new to travel. So there's kind of an education. There's also, a generational impact where we have now Gen Z travelers who are starting to travel. So how do you think traveler education has changed post-pandemic? Let's start with Anna. What do you think as far as changes?
Yeah, I think for me, I from my own personal experience, right, bringing it back to the personal experience, it has changed dramatically. Um, and so that's why I know we'll talk about technology, but that's why I really like the use of technology. I like to give the example when an employee starts, right, or when, a person who starts fresh out of college, they're usually given a copy of the employee handbook and the expense policy. I'm sure they read and memorize both policies, right? But let's face it, it's nearly impossible. So tools like Mesh, I think, are great because they build those policies directly into the platform. So employees don't need to remember every detail. They can clearly see their spending, and the technology has guardrails so they don't go outside of those policies. So from my perspective, it's really making it easy for the employees to do the right thing. And technology, there's a lot of great technology out there that helps them with that.
Lisa, how about your thoughts on educating the traveler post-pandemic?
Yeah, 100%. Like what Anna said about making it simple. If it's not simple, people are just not going to digest it. And I do think a travel policy is a great education piece and reference piece for travelers to have. It has to be very succinct. It's got to be very clear. It's got to be something that if I, as a traveler, want to know if I can get my dry cleaning reimbursed, that expense, it's got to be in the policy. But the policy's got to be like less than 5,000 words. It's kind of a yes, no. Here's your list of what's permitted and what's not. And then you build it into the technology like a mesh, like Anna was saying, so that they can read it and then it's reinforced at the time that they're doing the booking. But I think it's a great education piece.
Yeah. Well, it seems like policy is kind of a moving target a bit also, where and throughout all the decades I've been in this industry, I've yet to find an example where a top salesperson from a company was fired because they took the wrong airline. Now, if they file an expense report that's with charges, yeah, that are not appropriate, that's fraud, yeah, everyone gets canned. So can we talk a little bit about what really is policy compliance? Who owns policy compliance, and how can you enforce that? Because I have to admit that I've done many webinars and panels and things, and when I talk to travel managers, sometimes they sound like they're from the 90s. This is our policy. This is who we're going to use. You will do what I tell you. Is that really the world we're in right now? Or is it more of a collaborative and balance between customer needs and policy? Can you talk a little bit about that? Maybe Kim, if you can talk a little bit about that, please.
Yeah. In my experience and where I've seen other travel managers be really successful is when you have a policy, it's more about telling people what they can do than what they can't. And you really have to look at how enforceable is your policy, because I think that helps you define what needs to go in it, right? So have a conversation with audit, have a conversation with the owners of the policy. So if travel is one of those owners, it's usually finance, or corporate services or human resources that tends to own the policy as well. And you need to align on what you can enforce, what you should put in there, what can actually be measured, and what you're really trying to achieve. And again, this kind of aligns back to the strategy, but from an enforceability standpoint, I think it is really important to recognize what is it that you can do and what do you want the results to be if someone's non-compliant, because that really helps you set the standards for what needs to be contained within a policy. And then on the other side, it helps you educate travelers to say, this is what you can do. And you can use the technology that you have in place, whether it's, your online booking platform or your expense platform or your payments, to help guide you along the way. But the policy really, really needs to be succinct, as to Lisa's point, about what you want to put in there and what it really is you're trying to achieve. So putting a lot of things in there is thou shalt or you must. If you're willing to enforce those and you have the ability to enforce them either based on government or company regulations, then think carefully about what else you're going to put inside of it.
Well, that's wonderful advice. The idea of being more positive, here's what you can do, and making sure anything that shall not actually is measurable and trackable and has consequences. I thought that's great. Lisa, your thoughts on, how do you develop a policy that really has some teeth and that balances what can be done versus what cannot be done?
Yeah, and again, it ties back into having that governance structure, because that governance structure is going to help you with that policy. And if you put something in there that is a thou shalt not, then there's got to be a way to measure that compliance. Otherwise, it's just words on paper, right? I don't think I've really seen any very harsh travel policies. I've seen very wordy travel policies with lots of, you may do this if you are really tired. Like you make it very distinct. This is what you can do. This is what you can't do. And if somebody violates it, there's got to be a repercussion for it so that people know to follow it. And then to something you said earlier, Norm, was the age of the policy, right? It's something that really should be updated at least once a year or every other year. There's got to be a cadence to it because somebody who's onboarding now does not want to read a travel policy about non-refundable tickets for something that was industry rule back in 2022, right? Because it's just not going to make sense anymore. So it's got to be kept up and kept fresh. And if it's simple, a simple document, it's not too difficult to keep the refreshing to date.
And Anna, how does payments and policy work together? You mentioned about embedding policy within payments. What are the types of things that should be in policy around payments that you see corporations who are mesh customers use?
Yeah, so I just wanted to say real quickly on updating the policy. I think that's really important, especially now in periods of inflation. I don't know about where everyone's living on this call, but in New York, you can't buy breakfast for less than $20. And so making sure it's reasonable that you're not putting you're updating it based on the current economic situation is important. And embedding payments. I think, the great thing is now with the use of virtual cards and these technology tools, like I mentioned, you can really use that payment infrastructure to ensure adherence to the policies. And so I think that's really important, but there's also flexibility, right? So that an employee who needs to, travel, if they need a physical card or a virtual card, right? That there are ways for them to be able to handle all those scenarios. And so I think that's really the interesting thing with the technology. This is something that's very new, right? It's a few years old. And so I think that really helps remove this friction when an employee needs to travel.
Okay, so we'll talk a little bit more about virtual credit cards in a moment. So I have to throw the acronym out there. I would say that of anything that we have some industry fatigue about, it is NDC. A lot of industry fatigue. And it's almost like I don't want to hear about it anymore. Enough, now that American has had a change in management, everything's going to be okay. But I have experienced, I'm wondering if you all have experienced a client who, a senior corporate travel manager got called in because one of the senior executives basically said the TMC, pardon my language, is screwing us. That these TMCs are giving us higher prices than I can find direct. And so it's less around NDC as the industry has been talking about servicing and whether it goes to a GDS or bypasses or whatever, but more from an actual real environment where you have situations. I would think that most travel managers have had this happen. So, Kim, let me go back to you. And when you have a client who is in that kind of mode where they've been called into the office because some senior executive has found something cheaper on the airline.com site, how do you explain that? What steps need to be done to really kind of stay ahead of the curve of NDC?
Yeah, I think there's a broader question at play here. And as you know, I'm very passionate about this topic, but at the end of the day, it's about having access to content. And so regardless of where you are in your program and how you want to move forward, there are many different customers and no customer is the same, right? So you have to evaluate, one, where am I from a company standpoint? What is my program structure? What components do I want to kind of keep in this managed program? What's going outside of this managed program today? And are there ways that I can pull some of those things back in? So the question that you pose, it's not something we haven't heard before, right? We heard this back in the 90s. People were saying, online booking, I can find it somewhere cheaper, and they were calling and complaining about it. this is happening again. So I think as a travel manager, you need to be prepared, one, to have a strategy in place that addresses content. What content sources do you have? Forget NDC for a minute and think about, I already have hotel attachment rates that are probably at 50, somewhere in the 50% range. And how am I managing that with my organization today? That's one way you can address it. The second piece is decide, do I want to have a multi-channel program, and is that something I can manage, and does it align with my corporate goals and corporate culture? And then how do I go about doing that is one thing, but addressing the question directly, if you know what options you have and where you can get content from, then you can say, look, we're working through some changes within the industry now. There's new ways of working. So there are going to be instances where you may find something cheaper if you go direct. And as a company, let's tie this back into policy and governance, right? If your policy says if you find it cheaper elsewhere, people do that with hotels all the time. They book direct, right? They have high loyalty status. Sometimes they book direct because they know they can get that room. Then you can incorporate that into policy for air temporarily until you have a broader strategy in place that pulls that content into your program. So you really kind of have to think about where you are and not panic so much about one single instance or question, but how you're addressing that from a strategic standpoint overall. Then you can talk through the plan. This is how we're going to pull this content in, or we're going to allow people to go out, and I'm going to work with these airlines to sign up for either a small, an SMB type program where you can at least log it and capture it, or I'm going to have a direct booking strategy and have a multi-channel program.
That's great. So what you're saying is a more comprehensive and strategic view versus a reactive view to a single complaint. But it's tough. This client that I've been working with, it's all about strategy. We've been developing strategy now since the beginning of the year. And this interrupted our ability to do strategy because the travel manager was taken away to deal with this issue. Lisa, what's your feelings on this, on content and how to be more strategic about it?
Well, strategic is the word, right? So I think to everyone's point, everyone's gotten that question, why is this fare $400 more if I buy it through the agency? So by now we should all have an answer for that. But by now, everybody should be midway into creating a strategy, because it's not just answering that question. It's how, like to Kim's point, how are we going to address that in the future? What is the strategy in the future? That's where your head has to be at. You can't just be sitting here mitigating those questions. You have to come up with the strategy that's going to fit your company, whether it is to go and buy it direct, the way Kim said, or whether your company is going to say, well, we still want you to book through the agency, even though it is more expensive because of, what the company wants their travelers to do. But then that's a great question then for Anna, because now there's going to be these fares that may be coming through that are going to need justification for buying it at a higher price point. So, you toss it over to Anna to say, so
That's
I guess that depends on your company though, right? So your company is either going to want you to pay more because that's the nature of your company, or your company is going to allow you to go outside because maybe you have resources that can pull all those bookings together for security reasons or leverage or whatever. But depends on the company. But yes, travelers may be paying more right now until you put your strategy in place.
so how about it, Anna?
I mean,
Have you
I
as a
don't want to pay
CFO
more.
have you been exposed to higher prices through managed system versus going supplier direct? And from a CFO's viewpoint, how have you dealt with that?
Yeah, so it's not something that we've experienced a lot, but I would say look, I think again, it goes back to that transparency and really understanding what that means for the company. So if this was a situation that I was facing at my company, I would want to know, okay, here are the options, right? This is, stay our current course. This is what the impact will look like. allow some flexibility and employees to book a different way. Here's what it'll look like. And so for me, again, it's giving the executives the information they need to make the best decision. I would want to work closely with that travel manager to make sure we made the right decision for our company. And of course, every company is different.
That's great. Well, I think it's time to ask the audience about this question. So we have our first poll question, if we could please bring that up. And the question is, how has your travel program been impacted by the ability to access full content, whether it's EDIFACT, whether it's NDC or low-cost carriers? And either is it just a minimal impact, or are you struggling to obtain all the content and you have no ability to measure that total impact? Are you struggling to obtain all the content, but basically you are measuring it and you know where the lost savings are? Are you simply just being patient and waiting for the GDS and the TMCs to execute their NDC strategies and expect it all to be resolved soon? Or the last one is, my program has been able to integrate NDC content. So that's the solution. So let's see how that poll goes. Boy, minimal impact started on the race really, but a lot of people seem to be patient. And I guess, I don't know
I'd
how
like to see the bottom one increase a little bit, but that's just my personal opinion, Norm.
Well, I actually like to see number 2 or number 3 increase, because how do you know that it's had minimal impact if you are not measuring it?
Yeah.
I mean, we
Yeah.
talked about presenting information to senior management in the earlier part of this webinar, and that it's important to have your data together.
Yeah.
Well, how can anyone in today's environment be happy with? Now, how do you go about that? I think is challenging, because these NDC quotes are have a shelf life, they disappear. You would almost have to have an NDC against a EDIFACT comparison on every reservation for some period of time. And then there's some question I have in my mind whether NDC through the GDS versus NDC through an aggregator, or NDC through an API direct connect, all of the kind of these newer TMCs such as Spot Nano or Travel Perk or Navan, whether or not there's a difference. And I guess from my viewpoint, it's almost like we've got to understand what the problem is. Otherwise, we're just going to assume it's minimal impact because we haven't heard that much noise. But it looks like everyone wants to be patient. So I think we could probably close this the survey at this point. But it's pretty clear that most people are being patient. And I guess the question is, are you patient with your data, focusing in on this, or you're patient because you just trust your TMC and the GDS behind them to solve this? What's your view, Lisa? Do you think that people should be patient at this point? I mean,
I think this is the time for action. Patience, yes, but this is the time for action. Otherwise, the industry changes are going to take you over, before too long. I think it's fine to be patient while your GDS or your TMCs are figuring out their strategy. Their strategy may not be your strategy, though, right? So we know there's a lot of changes even in the TMC landscape that are coming. So to sit back and wait for them to develop their strategy, which is complex for their own reasons, may not be the best decision when you need to make a decision for your own organization now.
well, it was described by one of my clients is that they wanted to become the pilot of their program, and then have a co-pilot there. But I don't mean to degrade flight attendants, but a lot of them feel like they're flight attendants right now. They're not actually driving the strategy forward. So that's great insight there, Lisa. So Kim, how about you? What do you think about the fact that 44% of the attendees on the webinar feel like they're just going to wait until the GDS and TMCs fix the problem?
I'm going to say the same thing that Lisa said. It's time for action. The plane has left the runway. The ways of working are different than they used to be pre-pandemic. we're faced with, with some challenges on content disparity, and doing nothing is not an action. If you put a strategy together that says you're going to wait and see, and this is why, because you feel you have enough discounts in place and you have a strong mandated program through a single channel, you've got good net effective savings rates, you've got good policy compliance, and in working with finance teams, you're willing to take a little bit of a hit on lost savings, so be it. That's a conscious choice. But to really kind of sit and wait and see what's going to happen, you may have travelers that aren't speaking up, but the reality is there are lower rates outside of your program if you are not pulling all of your content into it. So I just view doing nothing as, or kind of this wait and see. Make sure that you have a strategy in place. If your strategy is to wait and see, then your strategy is to wait and see, but be prepared to get those questions, Norm, that you just talked about. There are realistically fares out there internationally that are thousands of dollars less on the .coms and the apps than they are through the GDS EdFact channel. I'm using some acronyms here, but through those channels, there is content disparity. And so if you do want access to content, you have to make some conscious choices. So it is time for action and less time for talk. We've been talking about content now for more than a decade. So I would just encourage people to at least, decide what that strategy is. And if your strategy is to not do anything for A, B, C reasons, fantastic.
But
And just to take
go
that a
ahead.
step
Go ahead, Lisa.
further, yeah, the minimal impact, the people that rated that they've had minimal impact, I would challenge those people to really take another look at their program, because I can tell you from clients that I've worked with that have come and said, yeah, our travelers are good. They know they have to use the agency. We're not having a problem with it. Well, when we married that up with some expense data and you start seeing the .coms, the impact wasn't negligible or minimal. It was something for them to start standing up and paying attention to. So you could just not be aware of the impact it's having because it's not coming through your traditional reporting in your traditional channels, right? So the minimal may be more than you assume it is right now, and will continue to become less and less minimal and more impactful.
And this is where Anna and her finance teams are seeing the differentials coming through in the data as all of the numbers roll up. And that's where the questions start to come. Why are we spending so much more on travel? This isn't necessarily all inflation driven, right? So you kind of have to figure out where are these increases coming from.
It's really been a de facto price increase. And I guess I struggle. I was at a GBTA event for the Bay Area on a panel, and I was just surprised with the same type of reaction. But meanwhile, they were talking about resort fees. Oh, we've got to get those, and resort fees are a little tiny bit of the puzzle. While I've seen cases of twice as much for a business class fare through an EdFact channel, through a GDS channel. So Anna, if you could maybe talk from a payment side, what's the role of payment in trying to as Kim and Lisa were suggesting, using data to track this and get a handle on exactly what's happening with content disparity?
Yeah, I think someone mentioned it earlier, right? You don't know what you can't track, right? So for me, I would want, if someone was telling me, oh, we're going to wait and see, I would want to understand, okay, well, show me the data that shows waiting and seeing works, right? From a financial aspect, we're going to still hit our goals. We're going to still hit our budget constraints if we wait and see, right? Or here's the plan to mitigate those lost savings. So from my perspective, and I think it's really important to think about, because to Kim's point, you're going to be asked these tough questions, right? Eventually, A good finance team will understand the data and understand that there are differences than what they expected, and will want to understand the go forward plan. So
Yeah.
for me, it's really about presenting it again in a way that the finance team can get comfortable with the strategy that we're moving forward with.
And
Great.
Norm, if I can just add to what Anna said, I think there's a real opportunity here for travel managers to transition, especially if they're feeling that they're in more of a tactical role, to becoming more of a trusted advisor. Use the data to your advantage. Work with your finance teams, talk to the CFO, help them understand, the message behind the data. What is really happening here? And provide information and reasons on how to continue to mitigate risk, right? How to keep costs to a minimum in this world where we are seeing, bigger increases right now, especially now that we're out of the pandemic, and travel is starting to increase again on the corporate side. We're not quite to 2019 levels, but that said, as things continue to rise, how do we get the best, the best value for each of the trips? How do we get the right value out of it? So becoming this trusted advisor to your executive team or to your leaders, your direct leaders, is really a way to elevate your role and not just kind of reacting to each issue that comes up.
Yeah, well, I think one of the challenges we have also, we talked about education, and also perhaps the fact that we've had some changes in travel management personnel. Some travel managers may lack the historical perspective to understand how much supplier compensation plays a role for profitability for the TMC. In other words, large TMCs earn more money from suppliers than they do from customers. And therefore, if anything's going to impact that relationship, I'm not knocking the TMC here. They have to be a profitable business, but there is some commercial conflict, not just technological conflict, about where this comes and how it's measured and how they get compensated. So it's a very challenging. We're not going to solve it on this webinar, but that was some great insight around content. I wanted to just touch briefly on this balance between loyalty. And travel loyalty, frequent flyer programs, loyalty programs, and the influence they play. It seems like, and certainly Kim, when we go back to you on this one, that you executed at Visa, and forgive me for trying to describe it if I describe it incorrectly, but I thought that you had partnered with United to try to use status as leverage in order to drive greater adherence to policy, versus back in the day. I can't remember Kevin's last name, but I remember 25 years ago at GBTA, he stood up and talked about the evils of loyalty programs and so forth. And it's like, well, no, the industry is not going to get rid of loyalty programs. So how do you balance that loyalty program driver for the employee with the corporate compliance and governance and channel management that you need to do? I think you've done some creative stuff in your prior role, right?
Thanks, Norm. Yeah, I think there's a few things to consider. One, as we talked about a little bit earlier, not every company is the same, and so you really need to look at your corporate culture and goals. That said, in my last role, I was in a position where we had strong compliance, but we also wanted to work with some of our strategic partners. And there are ways that you can influence not only policy, but influence the traveler experience without creating or driving non-compliance. So for instance, the airline might know that Kim or that I am willing to take or pay $150 to upgrade my flight on my own when I'm traveling personally. Being able to give the travelers the ability to do that can also help drive compliance to your preferred suppliers. So there are ways that you can work with them in order to negotiate or leverage some of those value adds, even if they are personal, that are outside of policy, but still gives them that same feeling that it's a personal trip or an experience. We've we've referenced or said we were going to talk a little bit about Gen Z and kind of understanding your personas and what types of things that they like, what they're interested in. The suppliers have access to a lot of this information from their loyalty programs. So rather than trying to block everything out, how can you bring some of those aspects in, but allow them to do those things, even if they're outside of policy, if it's on their own, at their own expense? And so companies like Mesh have some capabilities, with their payments and with the expense side to monitor some of that. But you can also do that on the front end with suppliers to say, look, we want to put these components in place as part of the program, but we also want to enable people to do some things on their own. So how can we combine those two in a way that's going to be successful so that I still have policy compliance, but my traveler still has the feeling that, hey, you know what, this airline's trying to cater to me and they know that I'm going to do this anyway. So I'm really glad that they offered it to me. I'm willing to go pay for it.
Okay. Well, that kind of does lead us to the next topic, which I promised we would talk about, which are virtual credit cards. And the VCCs are basically designed to do things like intelligent card limits to drive tighter control, stronger security, real-time visibility, and automated reconciliation, and then even an opportunity for rebates on transactions. So Anna, can you talk a little bit about the role of virtual credit cards and policy compliance and how you see that's being used out in the marketplace?
Yeah, so it's I find it ironic that I'm working at Mesh because at my last company, I refused to let anyone have a corporate card. I didn't want to manage it. It was such a pain to have to track down the receipts, to understand what the expenses were for. And so everyone did expense reimbursement. But that's also a pain, right? It's, employees have to pay with their own funds. Let's say they remember to submit their expense report on time, their manager remembers to approve it, the finance team eventually pays it. It could be a long time before that employee is reimbursed. So it creates a lot of pain. And so with the use of virtual cards and companies like Mesh, all of those pain points are eliminated. To your point, the approval is done before the spend happens. So the cards are set up with limits on the amount, the frequency, the merchant, the time period. So if someone's traveling, you can set up from June 12th to June 14th is the active period for that trip, right? There's a lot more control around making sure the travel or the expense adheres to the company policy. So it gives the employee the visibility into what those policies are, right? It's very clear. They know where the policies are and how to adhere to them, but also gives the finance team that control that and visibility to make sure that that's happening, right? So it gives them the comfort that the employee can spend within policy. And I think, you mentioned, this friction between employees wanting to travel and the loyalty and the company objectives. In today's day and age, right, it's really important for retention purposes and to make sure you have the best employees possible, that you have this type of flexibility, because I think that can be a real differentiator for companies, right? So if a company is very strict and they don't want to Kim's example, allow them to upgrade their seat, after a while it could be a reason for an employee to leave, right? Especially your employees who are traveling very frequently. It's something that's very important to them. So I think it's a retention tool as well that companies really need to think about.
Well, let's ask the audience about their use of virtual credit cards. Let's bring up our second poll, please. So what we're asking is how you use virtual credit cards. Do you use them as a tool to control trip costs per budget, as we just talked about? Do you use them for specific departments and projects? Are you using them for non-employees, for guests, for speakers, for crew travel? Are you using them to, are you exploring them, but you haven't implemented them yet? And then just simply, are you not using them? So, there there's a lot of hype around virtual credit cards, I guess, from my experience. And I'm curious, Lisa and Kim, your experience. I see it more number 2 or 3. In other words, it's used in specific departments or specific areas, but I have yet to see a company that's using it for everybody and having that. So, Lisa, what's your guess on what's going to happen here? We're pretty evenly split right now, other than we are exploring. There's a lot of exploration. There's a lot of patience and exploration that's happening with this audience.
Nice
A
audience.
very patient group.
I agree. Where I do see them used most frequently today is project or a big company meeting. I think that's the prevalent use for it. But I do see a lot of people exploring them. And I think these products have come a long way in the last couple of years, even just for things that might seem so simple, but being able to issue them in other countries, if you have a global program. So these programs have made great strides in accessibility and usability around the world. So I think along with all the other changes that we're seeing come down the line, this is going to be another one to address and maybe improve your program and your traveler satisfaction.
Well,
And
Yeah,
everything.
go ahead.
sorry, Norm. I
No,
would
go ahead,
say,
please.
you know, again, not to do a shameless plug, but the great thing about Mesh is we also have that physical card. So I think a lot of times the hesitation around virtual cards is, are they going to be accepted everywhere? So Mesh does have a physical card that links to that virtual card in the background. And so if you're going, you're an employee, you're traveling, you're checking into the hotel, you have that physical card to hand to the desk to check in, right? And so it's really important for companies to think about which partner they use, especially if they're, going to implement a virtual card program. Because I do think, physical cards right now, they haven't completely gone away, and it is important, especially when traveling, to have that ability.
Kim, what's your feeling on the use of VCCs?
Yeah, so well, they come in many forms, right? But I think that the migration or transformation is really toward digital payments. And the US is probably behind the rest of the world in how they're treating and using digital payments today. I think about, former colleagues and friends who have come to the US from outside and in certain instances won't bring their physical card to the restaurant or somewhere else because they know there's a digital wallet or some digital payment that is accepted, and just to prove a point they will say, hey, I have my phone, so let's figure out how to do this. And oftentimes they may have to go behind the bar or into some back office because the point of sale systems aren't as readily available as they are outside the US. But payments is going to be really the next disruption in our industry. And I really see a migration, because when you think about fraud and cybersecurity, the use of digital payments really helps to prevent a lot of the issues that we've seen in the past and or even currently. So as you kind of think about your program and the migration, there are a lot of great products that are out there. Talk to finance, get involved with, with the card issuers, find out what's available to you, and, see if those are things that are going to work within your program. But this is the wave of the future, and it is going to be a way to help support policy as well. So I would just say this is a really great opportunity to enhance your existing program.
So we seem to have a pretty passive audience here. I've been looking at the questions. No questions have
I
come
know.
up. We have about 6 minutes left in this session. I just would encourage anyone who has a question about this. We have a lot of people kind of waiting for NDC to be resolved. We're having a lot of people who are exploring VCCs. You've got an expert panel here who understands these subjects really well. Please don't be shy and ask a question. Otherwise, we will just continue to go on and talk. before we get to kind of the closing statement, I guess one of the things that, to kind of tie everything together between content, between employee satisfaction, between distribution changes, the question I have very simply for the panel is the lowest logical airfare still there? Well, I do see a question came in. So let me pause that because now people are starting to ask questions. Okay. So let me see here. Let me go to the audience questions first. I'll hold off on that question. Best way to handle non-staff expense reports, coming from Stratton. Comment on that. What's the best way to handle non-staff? In other words, I would assume that's non-employee expense reports, guest recruits, people like that. What's the best practice?
So I can tell you what we're doing at Mesh. We have, our technology will allow for that guest travel. So everything can be booked within our platform. It can be managed under the policies. And so that's one way I would just, recommend taking a look at the technology out there, because I think this is something that a lot of companies are solving for.
A lot of the platforms out there today, like Mesh, do have the capabilities for non-employee expenses. And so, to Anna's point, it's coordinating some of that with finance. The other aspect is the front end, right? For the full end-to-end trip. But working with the providers that you have, or, looking outside of those to see what's available to put a non-employee program in place that would support those expenses.
Great. Well, the next question concerns the servicing of NDC, the fact that we didn't address the service discrepancies, and are we going to address it? I guess I kind of avoided it purposely because there's been so much dialogue about this. And you have the 163 items that GBT highlighted that need to be done. And I feel like, and then you have other TMCs who seem to have full service capability today. So I would say that we need to somewhat get past this, in the sense that this is something I think being patient is probably right? I mean, I think a lot of the service stuff will be resolved over the next year or 2 years. But the question is it worth a differential to have a little extra service requirement in the back end? If it's 50% more for a EDIFACT fare, is it worth it? The TMC may charge you additional for servicing that record if they have issues, but isn't it better to do it that way rather than say, oh, listen, there's, this laundry list of things that have to be done. I can't do split ticketing. You can't do this and that. And therefore I'm going to just wait. What's everyone's feeling on that?
Think about the company budget. There's a budget for travel, and we've addressed this in the past with others. If it's cheaper elsewhere, they're allowed to go elsewhere to purchase it. It's going to continue to happen. You have to think about the end users and what is the ultimate goal. Suppliers are going to be happier to take the extra money. Let's just be realistic. But if we want to build trust and change the mindset, we have to look at how we're going to address getting access to content. And having access to that content is going to enable you to have access to the best value for your travelers at the point of sale.
Okay. Well, unfortunately, we're almost at the top of the hour. We had one more question about which actually was a question I was about to ask around the lowest logical airfare, because how do you judge that when you're booking outside the OBT or out of the GDS? But maybe you can address that, each of the panelists, and give us a little bit of your crystal ball things. I mean, everyone attends these webinars, hopefully for education, but also for some good strategic advice. So perhaps in summary, if everyone could just take a couple of sentences to say, here's what I would recommend you think about relative to all the subjects of changing technology. And we didn't get to talk about AI either, so you could answer that as well. So that's a lot for a couple of minutes. Lisa, could you try to do a few sentences on kind of a summary and crystal ball and perhaps address the lowest logical airfare issue as well.
Yeah, if I look at Joseph's question, I guess my question back to you is managing to the lowest logical fare the way you want to do business going forward? It's a question to think about because that may not apply anymore in the future, depending on your strategy.
Great, thank you. Kim?
It's about building trust across the entire ecosystem. You know, you have to have faith and trust in your employees that they're going to do the right thing by the company. You have to trust in your suppliers that you're going to be able to work with them to get the best, possible rates. You have to build trust with your travelers to help them understand that you're getting the best deals and bringing them the best content so that they can have the experience that they need to have when traveling. And you need to build trust with the executives to show them that you're aligned with the corporate goals and you're going to deliver the best value for the program that you can.
Great. And Anna, I'll as a sponsor, I'll let you have the last word here. What do you think should be on top of mind for these travel managers who are listening to this webinar?
Yeah, so I think, really be a partner with your finance organization, right? We all want to be successful. Make sure you understand the strategy. Really think of them as a partner in this process. And then, of course, take a look at the technology out there. There's so many great developments. And so just, again, be a partner with your finance organization, see them as a resource, right? And try to be aligned with the overall company strategy.
Thank you. Well, I have a feeling that this particular panel could have gone on for a couple of more hours. We have some great minds here and some great insight. So I apologize if we didn't get to all your questions. We'll try to answer them after this. It was an additional question that did come in. But I want to thank Anna and Kim and Lisa for your time, your insight, and your wisdom here, and for everyone for taking time out of their busy schedule to listen to the webinar. And thank you, GBTA, and for Mesh for sponsoring this webinar. Thank you for attending.